So we've talked a lot today about income tax, corporate tax, evasion, etc. But my presentation explores human rights, or this issue of human rights, through a different kind of taxation. So what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is a very age-old institution, and that is the levying of taxes against real property. And what I want to do today is kind of reconceptualize the way in which we think about the taxation of real property and kind of the underlying and intrinsic human rights consequences as to how and to whom and when and for what purposes we tax real property. So to get us started, I think it's helpful, since not many of the topics, I don't think any have touched upon this, for us to get our footing on a solid definition of what we mean when we say the taxation of real property. And really, just as a very basic and general conception, property taxes are those that are levied generally, usually by some sort of representative body. Of course, that is not always the case. On real property, usually land, any improvements thereon, buildings, structures, etc. And this tax is derived from sort of a two-step process. First, there is the government-sanctioned and sometimes government-administered appraisal process. And then it is accompanied by the applying of certain marginal rates and millages, the value derived from the appraisal, which then produces a tax liability. So of course there are jurisdictional nuances and complexities that cause the exact process and procedure to vary in terms of how we generate that. But generally this is the process. So we have a tax that is levied on a certain proportionate value of real property. And this institution, of course, has been around for a very long time. It's quite old. The first traces come in rock in the 600s, 6000 BC, excuse me. And even then, people had a relatively negative view of it. As you can see on the screen, we see one pearl of wisdom from an early property taxpayer. You can have a lord, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax assessor. So in these early days, tax was based more on direct production of land than on its fair market value. For farmers, for example, in ancient Egypt, usually it was 10% of the amount of the crops for a particular year and so on. And even the Rosetta Stone was, in fact, an instrumentality to signify an exemption from property taxes for the clergy. So the taxation of real property has been around for a really long time. If you travel to the Acropolis, even today, there is a monument raised to the honest tax assessor. And early England showed markings of property taxation, the Doomsday Book, and of course, Lady Godiva's ride naked through the town to protest the payment of taxation on her husband's property. And of course, lastly, America, from the States, too, has lots of experience with property taxes. The Pilgrims assessed property in proportion to the productivity of land, and the Puritans imposed property taxes to pay for religious education regardless of your creed. So property taxes have come to support a wide variety of things. Some are listed for you up here, but there are many others: utilities, water resources, distribution networks, wastewater treatment, sanitary sewer, schools, other educational institutions, fire, safety protection, etc., many, many more. But what's important to understand for our purposes, for what I want to discuss with you today, aside from just some interesting kind of historical background facts, is the economics and sort of the social goods distribution structure that underpins real property taxation. So first, the system in theory is by and large universal. So in other words, all persons owning real property generally pay some level of property taxes. And this represents a pooling of resources across economic spectrums, like all taxation. Those who own property of greater value pay more, while those who are lesser pay less. But regardless, everyone pays something. The tax is universal and has a proportionate application. And the revenues come in varying amounts from varying areas within a jurisdiction. The monies are pooled together to provide services across the jurisdiction without regard to the sort of geographic genesis, if you will, of the tax. So schools, wastewater services, health services are generally placed throughout the jurisdiction without regard to the proportionate location of where that share is paid. And this distributive effect, if you will, creates resource opportunities throughout the jurisdiction where some populations would otherwise not be economically strong enough to support them otherwise. So that poorer areas where property tax collections are low are able to nevertheless enjoy health clinics, public schools, sanitary sewer systems that are substantially funded by taxes collected perhaps from distant areas of a larger jurisdiction. So in doing so, the system engenders a sort of broad access to human services and produces the larger societal good. But what I ask you to consider today is the connection between the way in which we tax real property and the way in which we think about human rights. So the two things may not seem obviously coupled, but let me help you draw this kind of link. Obviously, access to clean water for us to drink and bathe, electricity to heat our homes and cook our food, and public services to treat us when we're sick and chronically ill are all part of the web of sort of human rights resources, if you will. And integral to the sort of dignity and integrity of humanity is the notion that we all have a right to some form of these basic needs. They're resources for which we attain human rights sort of expectations. And local governments, by and large, are the distributors of these basic human rights resources. They build and operate schools, many of the hospitals and public clinics, water treatment facilities, and in turn, these human rights resources, if that's what we can call them, are built and administered by local governments, are funded by the taxation of real property. In fact, in the U.S., for example, 3/4 of all local government revenues are derived from real property. Thus, the taxation of real property sort of sits at the core of what I like to think of as a human rights resources distribution. Am I a little too loud? I'm sorry about that. Back away. Of what I would like to call a sort of human rights resources distribution model. So this distribution model is premised as follows. So all persons within a given jurisdiction require access and use of these human rights resources, clean water, energy, etc. All persons within the given jurisdictions pay a tax based on the proportionate value of their property into a centralized fund. And then the local government allocates the revenues in this fund far and wide across the jurisdiction in proportion not to economic wealth, but to population, such that human rights resources are accorded to areas sort of on balance with the number of individuals within that area. So all persons within the jurisdiction receive the human rights resource that they require and continue to pay varying levels of property taxes into the fund going forward. But what we've seen, sort of in recent years, as we've seen in cycles past, is a sort of shift in political winds with regard to property taxation in many jurisdictions. There is a decreasing political tolerance for raising property taxes, or any type of taxes for that matter, due to feelings of sort of government mistrust or a sense of exasperation at the levels of property taxes that are currently being levied. And this is particularly true on the heels of the economic crisis and the meltdown in 2007 and 2008. On the other hand, we've also seen an increasingly prevalent focus by public and government decision makers on the localization and sort of the devolution of power from strong, upper-tiered, centralized levels to more local government. And the result of this in the U.S. has been a wave of government fragmentation. So more and more individual government authorities are being created, smaller subsets to manage functions that were once administered by the larger local government. So these new special purpose governments, if you will, have come to serve a wide variety of functions, sometimes neighborhood beautification, sometimes economic development, security patrols, or neighborhood amenities. We're talking about very small special taxing districts within a certain developed neighborhood subdivision community. And the theory that underpins this fragmentation is the idea that more localized decision-making promotes a more efficient distribution of goods, and so that only those who desire a certain mix of services obtains them and pays for them. And by creating a marketplace, sort of the public is able to geographically select a desired locale based on the right mix of services. And as I mentioned very briefly, the vehicle for this fragmentation is something called the Special Taxing District. And these are special purpose, local government created sub-districts that operate many times free from the typical government restrictions, local government restrictions, and they impose property taxes in the form of assessments against the parcels within their district, and then they use the revenues raised from these property taxes in furtherance of their particular purpose. They've been around for a long time. They've been used more widely to support things like electricity, education, irrigation, etc. However, they're being increasingly used in much smaller subsets and more, some might say, innovative ways that really are used truly to fund purely private infrastructure, private amenities. Some of them more noteworthy in the U.S. have been golf courses, community pools, landscaping, in other words. So certain groups of property owners are using these special taxing districts created by local governments at their behest to fund these sort of private amenities, services, luxuries through this semi-public mechanism of taxation. However, the problem with the use of property taxation that is often going unaddressed is how it has the potential to impact this human rights resources distribution model we discussed earlier. So let me explain. In the traditional model of property taxation, economic strength from certain affluent areas is distributed horizontally across the jurisdiction, such that places that would otherwise lack the tax revenues to support certain human rights resources are nevertheless accorded them. But through the use of this special taxing district model, we break down this distribution cycle. The economic strength in a given affluent locale, instead of being spread horizontally throughout the jurisdiction, is concentrated in only that locale, therefore creating a sort of vertical event. Moreover, only those with wealth and economic strength have the resources to obtain the creation and then to support a special taxing district, so there's often a stark divide between those with these new amenities and those on the edges. And the question that I pose today is how this fragmentation might create a future where special taxing districts are not merely used to provide private luxuries and amenities, but rather are used to fund better quality human rights resources. So in other words, instead of using these special taxing districts to fund the community pool, the social events, the park, they're used to fund better wastewater treatment facilities, better health clinics, better police forces, and fire services. So those within the district, these very small little communities, these almost little neighborhoods, enjoy a higher and higher quality of access to these human services, while those outside and on the fringes suffer an ever-increasing decline of property tax revenues, since they're being diverted to just these special districts, and correlative services decline as well. I see that how am I doing? 2.5 minutes, well, that is not enough time. I was going to show you kind of an example of this playing out, sadly, in my home state. But there was a group of kind of affluent individuals who decided that they wanted to break away from the much larger local government taxing district for their public schools. What would have ended up happening if the breakaway would have happened? It did not, although efforts have continued in our state house for the past 2 years, was the concentration of large communities of poor people of color left in the larger the larger taxing district for the schools. And the two newly created, much smaller special taxing districts would accumulate would have the vast majority of the property net assessed value in the larger county, and would also have the more affluent incomes. So I can't do that for you, but I have some great maps, some great numbers, and some fun icons. So anyway, public education, so I was going to kind of show you this public education piece. Public education is very idiosyncratic, but I think this little case study and my conversation about it can really teach us something in concrete terms about the larger conversation of conceptualizing real property taxation as a human rights issue. The long-term implication is that while today maybe something like public schools, community pools, and parks, tomorrow it may be water treatment, sanitary sewer infrastructure, health services districts. When we allow and accept a system whereby only those who can pay for a higher quality or greater abundance of human rights resources, who can opt out of the larger distribution cycle to the detriment of those living at the edges, we see serious human rights consequences. So local governments and policymakers and citizens really need to be aware of this subtle, sort of yet important creep of the continued fragmentation of governmental services through the manipulation of property taxes. So I thank you very much.